Starting in 1981, the American HIV and AIDS epidemic of the 20th century resulted in over 150,000 AIDS-related deaths in its first 10 years, over 2.5 times the total estimated American deaths in the Vietnam War. But which topic do high schoolers spend a week learning about and which gets passed over completely? With public knowledge lacking, especially among younger generations, I set out to explore why this significant time period in American history is often neglected from our country's mainstream narrative.
Lance Poston. I am the university's Director of Institutional Inclusion and Community Engagement, which includes directing the Office of LGBTQ Resources and the Center for Graduate and Professional Diversity Initiatives. So HIV and AIDS was something when it was discovered in the 1980s that was unlike any sort of a virus, and something that quickly became a public health crisis on a scale that we certainly hadn't seen in the same way ever on a national and a world stage. And it certainly had an impact, a disproportionate impact on several groups, including gay men, so the largest impacted group in the U.S. in the 80s, and continues to be one that is disproportionately impacted by the virus. It was an event in national history that also shifted the way that LGBT organizing looks, right? So we don't want to fuel a myth that that HIV or AIDS is a gay-specific disease, because we, of course, know that many different people are impacted by the virus. But we do know with larger numbers of, particularly in the early days of identified cases in gay communities, largely again gay cisgender communities, that the way activism had looked from the gay liberation years of following 1969 through the late 70s shifts in some distinct ways, and we see the creation of national groups like ACT UP out of New York that really become voices of LGBT movements in the 80s and 90s. I don't know that I would agree that it's faded into the past. I think it's less of a conversation for a generation of folks who are mid-20s and younger than it certainly was for folks who are a little bit older who didn't have things like PrEP to sort of change the playing field, and certainly very different for folks who might be 40 and older, who lived through a time where who can remember the 80s, were adults in the 80s, and saw the very different and sort of brutal impact that the virus had. So I think it depends on where you are geographically, on how you identify, and the sort of racial and economic communities you're in, whether you're more exposed or less exposed to those conversations today. So I think they're still around. I think they look different, and you interact with them differently as individuals who come from different places and hold different identities. I think part of that is a broader conversation about why LGBTQ voices, or why other marginalized voices, why African American histories or women's histories are not seen as the dominant lenses through which we talk about history in structured or unstructured ways. I think some of it is discipline-wide and understanding how dominant voices play a part in writing the history, that it can be really tunnel visioned, and that at the end of the day has to privilege some voices, but we don't often think about whose voices we're privileging and whose we aren't. Oh, I mean, I think understanding all of our histories are important parts to inform or help us develop who we are today and how we understand ourselves, but also as we either individually or a part of groups, are thinking about what we want the future to look like, and right, organizing in formal ways or in more organic ways to, from voting to protesting. Being informed about your past is the best way to right, move forward in an educated, holistic sense for the future. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important. Yeah, well, I think there are, um, government can often be slow on many fronts. I think HIV and AIDS was a disease that acted much quicker, and sort of came out of nowhere, and then thinking about epidemiology and other issues in a public health sense that we dealt with in that century. And so the sort of cogs of government weren't prepared, hadn't had practice, had never had to move as quickly. I think there's also political resistance to seeing this as a gay disease, right? So HIV was first actually named before those initials, GRID, the gay-related immune deficiency virus. Again, falsely but directly connecting that to being a gay disease, and at a point when LGBTQ folks had very little legal rights. Actually, there were widespread laws that marginalized LGBTQ folks, including say sodomy laws across the country. There wasn't, in the 80s there wasn't a whole lot of zeal with all of those pressures in the background to make fast change, to support or help a dying population that was seen by many as a nuisance or immoral. It's such a significant moment or period, right, in LGBTQ life, if we think about particularly the height of the epidemic in the 80s and early 90s. I think it's important, and I've said this several times, so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it's important to remember too that it isn't an epidemic that disappeared after the early 90s, and that depending on your demographics and where you live, how much money you make, what the color of your skin is, you could still be at incredibly high risks of contracting the virus. So there's still work to be done. It's not as if it was finished, and we don't need to worry about it anymore.
I'm Annette Pelletieri. I'm 18 and I go to Connor High School. Honestly, from school, nothing other than that it's a STD. Everything that I know about AIDS, I learned from that Tom Hanks movie, Philadelphia, where he's the lawyer that gets AIDS. And yeah, I mean, there's not much in school. I believe they mentioned there was an AIDS epidemic in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And we knew that there were a lot of, celebrities that had, had Freddie Mercury had it, how, but in that it was associated with the gay men especially. But it was more just mentioning it.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that we focused on, no. Well, I'd say everyone has a decent idea of what it is. I mean, as far as like how it is, an immune system illness, and but I think a lot of what we have learned is through celebrities that we've seen, like in different movies we've watched, like the Tom Hanks one I mentioned, or like the Magic Johnson, they put that documentary on too. So no, I would say that no one is extremely well informed, but I would say in general, young people have an idea of what it is. I think it became very controversial because of its association with gay men. Also, I do remember other things that we learned about AIDS. It was either associated with gay men, or it was associated with the AIDS crisis in Africa. So the poorer countries. So there was never really much talking about just regular, not regular AIDS, but how it can affect regular people in a regular community. It was always either ostracized as like gay men or Africans, it was very polarized. I think it's important for everyone. I think, there are things that need to be clarified about how it isn't just something that gay men can transfer. It's something that can affect anyone at any given time, like any other variety of STDs. And I think that is important for everyone, important for the LGBT community to clarify things, that it's not just like, our disease, and also important for, everyone else to realize that it isn't our disease and that it's something that can affect everyone.